the law. What to do about the law? Here's a verse you're probably all familiar with, at least the last part there that I highlight or underlined. For sin will not be your master, because you are not under law, but under grace. It's really good news. So, what is that saying? Is it saying that the grace has replaced the law, superseded it? The answer depends on what you mean by law. Depends on what Paul meant by law. Let's see a couple other times that he uses this word law. I highlighted a few phrases there. In 1 Corinthians, he talks about people outside the law. There he kind of seems to be talking about the Mosaic covenant. Right? There's people that are outside that, and he's trying to reach them. But then he starts saying that there is a law of God, whatever that means, and the law of Christ. Romans 8. Now there's the law of the Spirit. We got all three of them now. Law, God, Christ, and the Spirit. The Spirit of life in Christ Jesus has set you free from the law of sin and death. Does he mean the same thing? Is he calling the Mosaic covenant law a law of sin and death? Or does he mean something else? He means something else. But what? And he says in Galatians that carrying the burdens of one another somehow fulfills the law of Christ. There's that phrase again, law of Christ. And that's just a few. He uses this word a lot in many of his epistles. And that's just a few places. But the thing is, he uses law to mean a lot of different things, and you got to look at the context, and you can't just lump it all together in your head. Sometimes he is referring to like the actual commandments in the Mosaic law, covenant. Sometimes he's referring to like just the covenant itself, kind of. Sometimes he's referring to the consequences, the curses from not following it. Like when he says a law of sin and death, it's something that happens when you're not following God's law. And then when he says things like the law of Christ or the law of the Spirit, he seems to be alluding to some kind of like universal something. Well, maybe not universal is maybe not their best word, but something that a little more transcendent, that's not just contained in the laws of Moses or in any other expression, but maybe something higher up, something that's spiritual, something that's in our hearts. It's like a maze of all these different meanings that he's using the same word for. And one of the reasons I want to talk about this today is because I think that we jumble all that in our heads, and we don't know what to do with the Mosaic law. Not really. We get an idea maybe of from what we see other Christians around us do, but most of the time it's treated as old-fashioned, antiquated, not really applicable, maybe something bad. Even though Paul says it was good and perfect, he says some other things that make it sound like he thought it was not that great. Which is why he said later, actually it's good and perfect. That's not, he's trying to clarify what he's saying. But man, it just, am I the only one who's ever been there that's been like, man, there's just a lot of stuff going on here. And mostly I just feel like going, okay, well that was then and this is now and we're under grace now and law doesn't matter anymore. And so we're just gonna go forward with grace. whatever grace means. So let me highlight one reason Paul has this problem, or we have this problem when we're reading Paul. Here's some words that are used in the Bible to talk about the law, different words around the law, right? Not all of them mean law, like some of them mean commandment, but a commandment is one of the things in the law, right? What do you notice about this list? How many Hebrew words are there, and how many Greek words are there? There's a lot more Hebrew words. And this isn't every word, but it's more or less the main words, right? Like when I say commandment, command is also a word that's used, but command and commandment are all, just like in English, they're the same root word, just like jump and jumping are the same root word. So I didn't include extra words like that. There's just a lot richer vocabulary, and read Psalm 119. He just goes nuts over with all these words, because that's what all of Psalm 19 is about God's law, and it's the longest psalm. So he has a lot to say about it. And in the New Testament, though, in Greek, there's not as much of a rich vocabulary, and so you kind of got to do a little extra work to figure out from the context what he's saying. When he says law, when he says commandment, what does he mean, right? But I do want to zoom in a little bit on that first word, Torah. And, law is a common translation in most English versions most of the time. It has a history for that I won't elaborate on right now. I'll save you the agony. But it means like guidance or instruction. Like in the literal sense, it's throwing something, like casting a line, so that then you can follow that, right? It's something to guide by. It's a direction that you throw something. And so it came to mean metaphorically guidance, instruction, teaching. And so when we're talking about the law, when we say that the first 5 books of that we know as the Pentateuch are also known as the Torah, it means instruction. Those books are instruction. They're teaching. They're teaching for us. And what's weird about him is that if you read the first 5 books of the Bible, how many commands do you notice in Genesis? There aren't any. In fact, you get like halfway through Exodus before he starts giving the first one, and then they come thick and fast. But there's all this story mixed in there too. And if you look at the laws, you realize these aren't really very complete, are they? Like there's a lot that's left out. They don't, there's a lot that's described. Well, the priest got to do this and got to do that, but there's a lot that's not said what the priest got to do. It's just kind of just the general highlights maybe. And they had to decide how they were actually going to put it into practice, especially when they built a temple instead of a tabernacle, because those were all written for a tabernacle setting. Anyway, my point is those books, the instruction is the story and the laws. The laws are in there mixed. You'll notice a story, a block of laws, a story, a block of laws, and they're related to each other. They're in a story framework, and the teaching, the instruction is these stories. And that's another rabbit hole I won't go into, but yeah, why did he give us some stories instead of a rule book? Would we have done better if it was just a set of rules? Would we have paid attention to it? Would we have really learned it well compared to what a story does about people and what they did or didn't do that was according to what God would have wanted. So I find it useful for me to just think of when I see law and I know that it's Torah, to just think of instruction or teaching, because that's what this is about. It's to give us instruction and teaching on how to be good humans, the kinds of humans we're supposed to be. And I'll get a little nerdy for a second, because this will explain a few things that I'm going to talk about later, and maybe explain a few things you've been wondering about. But there's people that really nerd out on studying ancient law codes. And starting maybe 50, 70 years ago, they started like realizing and understanding that how we think of laws in a modern society is not how they thought of them back then. Our modern society is that first one, a legislative society, where there's maybe a group of people that we have an idea of like what's the right thing or the wrong thing, or how we want to live our lives, and we write it down, but then the actual written version is the law, not what was in our heads when we started. Once it gets written down and approved by everybody that it's going to affect, or their representatives, that's the law. And this art that like people in Congress, have to try to make something specific enough that it means something, but vague enough that it can be adapted in 20 years when maybe situation is different. And it's because the written law is the actual law. And this works great in a literate society where you have, you can print it, people can read it, you can distribute it. It's great. If you're in a society where you can't easily just distribute a whole bunch of written material with that law, it's not easily accessible, or if it was, you wouldn't be able to read it anyway, it's not so useful. So we won't be surprised to hear that ancient societies had a more non-legislative view of law, what's called custom law or common law. It was a group of people that said, these are the things that we think are right, these are the things that we think are wrong, or here's the things that we are going to say are right or wrong, and we're going to live by these things. And yeah, you write them down, but the written versions are kind of an expression of what's really in your head. What's in your head is what everybody is living by. And this works really great when there's a group of people that are all the same, right? The more you mix cultures, this can be a problem because not everybody has the same thing in their head. But when you're all from the same clan or whatever, you all grew up this way, learning, okay, yeah, like it's a no-brainer. We can't read it anyway. We might write it down for a few folks to have it, to be able to refer to it, because society is advancing. But mainly, we hear these expressions and we know that they embody something deeper, something transcendent. So, is that making sense? Two differences. The main difference is the actual written version is the law versus the written version is an expression of what we mean by this rule. It's an example maybe, or a case study. And you give a few of those and you start to get the idea. And ancient societies were that second one, because they, most of them couldn't read, and because they were all the same people group. And this is why when you read like the Old Testament, when you read the Torah, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, you start to notice a few things that are a little weird, and they're explained by this. So, what kinds of things? Well, you'll notice that a lot of the commandments in the Torah appear more than once. And sometimes they're just copied, like they appear exactly the same way the second time. And other times the verbiage is tweaked a little bit. And I don't mean like they replaced in with on or something like that, but tweaked in some way that's like significant, but doesn't change the heart of it, but does maybe add or, your understanding of it. There's one law: do not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. That it's the only one that appears 3 times, and that one appears 3 times exactly the same way. I don't know why. It's very weird. Of all the ones, the 10 Commandments don't appear 3 times, just 2 times. That's the one that appears 3. But anyway, maybe someday I'll read about somebody who's figured that out. You notice I don't have much hope of figuring it out myself. But yeah. And sometimes these laws are changed or tweaked depending on circumstances. So let's look just real quick at a couple examples. In Exodus 12, they're celebrating the Passover like Passover 0, right? Ground zero for Passover. It's the original, like when it's not just remembering something that happened later. This is the first time they're actually painting, the doors of their houses to make sure that they don't get visited by this angel of death that's killing their firstborn in Egypt. And a year later, they've been out in Mount Sinai for a good while. They haven't left yet. They're about to leave. But it's been a whole year. It's time to celebrate Passover again. And so they do. And everybody's like, oh, yeah, this is great. But something happened in between that first one and that second one, which is in Leviticus, God handed out all these laws about purity. And purity just means ritually, right? It doesn't mean you've sinned. It just means it's a long story. But it doesn't mean you've sinned. It just means you've done something that makes you ritually impure, and you got to do some things to cleanse yourself. Bathing in water and some things like that, and allowing a certain amount of time to pass. And it had to do with usually symbols of life and death, especially death. So in this case, some guys had touched a dead body. Like maybe their relative died and they had to bury him or something, like whatever the reason. They had to touch the dead body. It wasn't like they had any choice. But because they were unclean, they couldn't celebrate the Passover. And they were bummed about that. Like, you might think, oh, I'll use this as a pass to, like, not have to do this ritual once, like save myself the pain. But that's how we might think of it if we think the laws are like a burden. But they were, like, really bummed about it. They're like, this is something good for us that we didn't get to participate in because of this other thing that happened to us. And so they raised their hands and said, we don't think that's right. We don't like that. Moses, what should we do? And Moses says, I'll ask God. And God says, yeah, just have them celebrate it on the second month. Normally Passover is on the 15th day of the first month. He says, just have it celebrate them the second month. And you know what? Let's make it a rule for everybody from now on. And not just if you're unclean, but also if you're traveling. Just bam, like that. There was a law that said you have to celebrate it on the 15th of the first month. If you don't celebrate it, you're in trouble. But then these guys couldn't celebrate it, and then God says, yeah, well, let's change that. Let's have a makeup session. That's in the Old Testament, the law being changed. Here's an even more interesting one. Later on in Numbers, this is at the end of Numbers and near the end, and they're about to go into the land, and they do a new census because they'd done a census at the beginning, but all those people are dead now, right? The rebellion, the spies, all that part. So they do a new census, and they have the names by their fathers' clans of all the people. And God says, okay, when you go into the land, distribute the land according to those names of the census you've taken. And everything's going to be proportionate. If a tribe is big, it's going to get a lot of land. If a tribe is small, it's going to get a little bit of land. If a family is big, they're going to get a little more land. If another family is smaller, they're going to get a little bit of little land. And that's what he said to do. Well, next chapter, 4 ladies 4 ladies, 5 ladies. This guy named Zelophehad had 5 daughters. That's it. No boys. And they came forward and said, hey, we're about to go into the promised land. It's like the land of milk and honey. It's the Eden spot that God is giving us. He's going to rest us in this land. But because our father only had daughters, and because inheritance only works, that's the assumption under this, inheritance only works through the male line, like we won't get any. Our house won't get an inheritance, our father's house. And we don't think that's right. Our house would miss out on this Eden blessing just because he only had daughters. Like, look, our father wasn't perfect. He was one of the guys that rebelled and didn't want to follow the spies, but everybody else is getting their place and we're not. And Moses says, okay. He says the same thing as before. I'll ask God. And God says, look right there what I put in bold. The statements of the daughters of Zelophehad are right. God says, they're right. It would be wrong for us to do this, for me to do this, for you to do this, however you want to dice it. It would be wrong for them to not get. And so, from now on, new rule. And I didn't put the rest of it where he says it's rule for everybody from now on forever. But he says, for them and for everybody else from now on, territory, the land will go to the son. If it doesn't have a son, it'll go to the daughter. And then he lists a few more. If there aren't any daughters either, then he starts listing who it goes to, right? But he says this will be a new statute. He just said, do it this way, and then they said we think that the commandment to distribute the land by our father's houses is actually conflicting with the purposes of God to give us a good land to each of our tribes and our clans, because we'd be missing out. We think there's a conflict here, and we think this is injustice. They went to the tent. Look at there in verse 2. They go before Moses and Eleazar, who was the high priest at the time, at the tent of meeting. Like that's like taking it to the Supreme Court. Like they had a bone to pick here. And God said, yeah, they're right. Let's change this. Jesus comes along, and he says famously in the Sermon on the Mount, you know, I didn't come to replace the law. Like, I came to fulfill it in every sense. There's not one scratch mark. Have you ever seen Hebrew written out? It has like all these little ticks, and have you ever seen it? Anybody? All these little marks, like apostrophes and little weird, but they mean something, right? They're not just somebody's pen slipped. So he says, not even one of those little ticks and marks is gonna be left out until it's all fulfilled. He says, not only that, if you try to set aside the law, he says, I'm not coming to set aside the law. If you try to set aside the law and you teach somebody else to do that, you're in big trouble too. And he says, what's more, your righteousness is going to have to be greater than the Pharisees, who were like the most righteous dudes around. Your righteousness is going to have to be greater than theirs just to get in to the kingdom of the skies, the kingdom of heaven. He starts talking about some kind of greater righteousness. And what he does, so he didn't say, we're setting aside the law. He said, in fact, it's staying. It's so staying. But then right after this, he goes on to give like 6 case studies of where he kind of seems to update the law. Well, that would be a problem for a society where the written law is the only version. But remember, I just told you, they were a society where the written version is embodying something bigger. And Jesus starts to look for the greater wisdom in those laws and to explain it. And he has 6 case studies because he's not saying these are the only 6 things where you can do this. He's just giving 6 examples. Right? You all know them, or at least you can probably think of 2 or 3 of them, right? Where he says, hey, this don't murder thing, it's actually about not even hating. Because hatred is just murder in seed form. And I want to get the whole root plant out. Right? He says the same thing about adultery and lust. Lust is just adultery in seed form. He talks about making oaths. When you try to swear by God or by the temple or by something to kind of spin what you're saying, to kind of make it sound like you're a little more honest, you're using God's credibility to make yourself sound like you're a little more honest than you really are, maybe. He says, just don't do that. Just say yes or no and be done with it. And he starts looking to this greater, deeper wisdom in these laws. That's the greater righteousness that he's calling them to. And Jesus isn't the only one to do this. In Acts 15, it records this huge debate, probably the biggest crisis of the church in the first 50 or 100 years. What will we do with all these Gentiles? And there was a raging debate between a faction that said, yep, well, we love them. Yeah, God's bringing them. But they got to get circumcised. They got to eat kosher. They got to follow the Sabbath. They got to obey all the rules. And then, they're going to be part of Messiah's family, but they got to do all that stuff. And people that were passionate, trying to follow Jesus, and that's what they saw. And there were another group that was passionate, trying to follow Jesus, and they're like, no, we don't think that's necessary or what Jesus wanted. And so they meet to discuss it. And that's really what it says they did, is they just talked about it and debated. There's probably some prayer in there, I guess, right? But they just talked about it. And these are all people that are like immersed in the Bible. And they're talking about it all. And then finally James, who was the brother of Jesus, James, who was the leader of the church in Acts, or in Jerusalem, stands up and goes, look, here's what I think is going on. He said, I found this verse that says, and he quotes from Amos. After these things I will return and build up again the tent of David that has fallen, and the parts that have been torn down, and I'll build it up and restore it, so that the rest of humanity may seek the Lord, even all the Gentiles who are called by my name. And he says, hey, Amos talked about the Gentiles coming to God, so I think it's okay. He says, it's my conclusion that we shouldn't put any barriers in front of them. Like, they come from a different culture, a different mindset. Like, don't make them do all that stuff. Just a couple of them. Don't eat blood and abstain from meat sacrificed to idols. Just do a couple of them. And the rest you're... And did they change the law? They were certainly seeing something for the first time that was already there. And Amos isn't the only place. One of my favorites is in Isaiah 19, at the end, middle of the chapter. He starts talking about there's going to be a highway from Assyria to Egypt. And he says, and they're going to worship. They're going to go back and forth, and they're going to be worshiping God. And he ends with the phrase, "Blessed be Egypt, my inheritance, Assyria called by my name, and Israel, my people." And he names Israel third. He says, Israel's going to be third. Egypt and Assyria are going to follow me first. It's the weirdest thing to find in the middle of Isaiah, especially when you consider when Isaiah was writing this. Assyria and Egypt are, other than Babylon, those are the two biggest, baddest empires, enemy empires in like the whole history of their nation. Anyhow, they heard from the Spirit, and that's the conclusion. They write a letter, and they said, it seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us to not lay any more burdens on you. And he write this letter out, and they send it. That was how he described it. That the Holy Spirit, in that kind of anointed debate they were having, the Holy Spirit was speaking to them through their discussions, their debate, and the scriptures. And they saw something that was there all along that they hadn't noticed. A deeper wisdom. And that's what they concluded. And both, they're doing what Jesus taught them to do, to look for the heart meaning of it, the deeper spiritual meaning of what's going on, not just through the laws, but what God is doing in history. Jesus modeled that for them. They did it. One more is where Paul does it. Are elders like oxen? Maybe. There's a law in Deuteronomy that says you shall not muzzle an ox that is threshing, or some of the threshing. Some of them say treading wheat. Right. The idea is you have this. I won't describe it all, but there's a contraption powered by an ox that separates the grain from the chaff, so that you can process it into meal and later flour and whatever. And as he's walking around in this thing, this ox, some of that grain falls down, right? Well, do you want to sweep it up and keep it? Make sure the ox doesn't eat it? Then that would be a reason to put a muzzle on the ox. But the law of Moses said, don't do that. Let him eat. He's doing the work. Let him eat some of it. And if it weren't for this example of Paul's, which he loves this example, he used it in Corinthians too. Is that the first law that you would think, man, I bet I can find God's deeper wisdom out of that law? Is it? Like, none of us are farmers, and if we were, we wouldn't be using oxen to separate the grain. That's an antiquated law that doesn't apply to me in any respect, you might think. But Paul comes along, steeped in these things, and he sees a deeper wisdom, and he concludes that if a person is doing the work, and he pairs it with something Jesus said when he was sending out the 72, when he said, hey, go into a house, and if they accept you and they give you food, eat it, because a laborer is worth his wages. So he puts those two together, and he goes, I think God's deeper wisdom here is that if you're doing the work for somebody else's benefit, you should still get a little bit of the benefit yourself. It's okay if you do. That grain is for the guy, it's not for the ox, but it's okay if the ox gets a little bit, right? Because he's doing the work. And he goes into really long diatribe with the Corinthians about it. And that's a whole other whole other sermon. But it just strikes me, it's not the law that you would think, yeah, that's the one, I'm sure. Like, okay, do not murder. Yeah, I bet I can get, do not bear false witness. Yeah, I'm sure there's some deeper wisdom there. I'm sure there's some deeper wisdom behind, a lot of these laws. But then there's ones where you're like, I don't know if I can ever come up with one here, like the goat and the milk, the goat in the mother's milk. I don't know. Paul was led by the Spirit to understand something deeper. That's how they approach this law. What does it tell me about how I should approach this law? Should I just say, that's then and should I be lazy and say, well, I'll just go with the ones that Jesus and Paul and them already kind of translated for me and like updated for me? But I won't dig into any of the others because that would be work. Just food for thought. So let me try to land the plane. The Mosaic Law was written for a certain people in a certain place at a certain time. It's the terms of a covenant. We're not in that covenant. We're in a different covenant. But that new covenant kind of sprang from the old one. Jeremiah prophesied where God said, I'm going to make a new covenant, and what I'm going to do for this new covenant is I'm going to write my laws on their heart. So it's still God's law. Is it the Mosaic law that's written on our hearts? Well, remember, they were a custom law, common law type of society. The law is a representation of something greater. And even in that society, updating it and changing it for their situation, it was different when you're a nomadic people living 40 years in the desert. How it applies to you is different than how it's going to apply to you when you go into the land. That's why the book of Deuteronomy is written. He's updating them all, okay? Here's how it's going to be a little different when you're in the land. You're not going to celebrate the Passover wherever. You're going to have to go to wherever the temple is to celebrate it. You can't celebrate it just in your house. Before, it was okay to celebrate it in your house. Anyway. So, this law is now a spiritual reality in our hearts. And there's a deeper wisdom, a greater righteousness that Jesus calls to. And this law written on our hearts is also his way of describing that he's actually going to make us able to fulfill it. So when Jesus is fulfilling it, we're right in his footsteps doing it too. In this greater way. But we're not under the same consequences of the law, right? If you don't do it, you're going to be, get all these repercussions, all these curses. That's what Jesus died to take away. But I come back then to, as Mike indelibly said it, so what, right? Like when we're preaching, it's good to give this, whatever, it can help. But then so what? Well, what's the so what? And so here's a few things that I just want to leave you about in a so what. To ask the Lord about, or maybe he's already pricking you right now, or maybe he will when I start talking through them. But the law of God is in our hearts. What's written down is Torah for us. It's teaching. It's instruction. And we can get something from that. And we're not supposed to just ditch it. What does it mean for God's law to be written on your heart? There's a law of some kind from God that's written on your heart. The much talked about two sides of this balance. Are you abusing that grace? I'm not under the law anymore. I'm under grace. I can do whatever I want. I'm out of control and I do what I want. Grace will cover it. Paul says, no, of course not. That's not what I mean. He was writing in Romans and got to a point where it's like, if I don't clarify this, they're going to think that that's what I meant. And so he does. But then on the other hand, should I just be beating myself up like, I can't, I got to just try harder to do all these things, to stop getting angry with my family, to stop yelling at the driver on the road, to have more trust that he's going to provide for me. I just need a man up, put my big girl pants on, and do it. That looks like doing it in your own strength, and it looks like if you miss the mark, then what, right? If you're not relying on grace, then what? But both are true. Like this, they're both true. You can't say, well, God will forgive me, so it's okay. But you also can't beat yourself up or let the enemy beat you up when you miss the mark, or be afraid that he's going to punish you or something like that, something crazy. How are you going to discern God's direction for the new situation that you're in? Maybe God's direction that was there all along. How are you going to discern that? You're in a new situation. There's very little that the Bible has to say, maybe nothing that the Bible has to say about gender dysphoria. How should a Christian respond in the dozen variations of whether it's a person struggling with it, whether it's a person accepting it, whether it's the society making you want to accept it, whether it's society making you want to reject it, like all the things that can happen to you on that topic, how do you respond? What's God's law for that? It's not there in what's written in plain English or Hebrew or Greek. But there is deeper wisdom to be found there. How are you going to find it if you haven't meditated on what is there? Let me say it a different way. How are you going to hear the Rhema word of God for the moment if you haven't meditated on the Logos word of God that's written down? And then how are you going to know you're on the right track unless you maybe run it by a couple of people that you trust? And the bigger the situation, maybe more people. How are you doing in that area? Is this something that you're like, I'll just, I don't think there's much there for me. How are you going to know? What does it mean that God instructed? Why did he instruct us through a story? Why didn't he just make it a set of rules? What does he know about our nature? How does he think this is going to be better? Like he thinks this is going to be better than a set of rules, or else he probably wouldn't have done it that way. Is it just a story? Is it just history? Is it just video camera footage or an approximation of something that happened to these people a long time ago? Paul says these things were written down for our instruction, for Torah. They're Torah for us. They're teaching. They're guidance. And And many of us have grown up being taught them as children's stories, when they're actually, in some ways, so simple that a child can understand them, but in every other way, highly sophisticated commentaries on what's wrong with us, on what we need to fix what's wrong with us, on what God planned to do about it, all that stuff. Highly sophisticated commentaries on that. Let's not just minimize them to a children's story about a young boy killing a big guy with a rock, or a man jumping overboard and being swallowed by a fish. The law, God's law, is written on our hearts, and we sense it when we're close to it, but we need to be transformed by the renewing of our minds. That's what Paul says. It's a process, and meditating on his words, discussing them with other people is what brings us to that point. All right?